Good evening, I'm Pat Mannon. We're glad that you've joined us tonight for the study. And along with Heather Thomas, I want to welcome you to this study and thank you for being a part of it. We're coming to you live from Northwest Arkansas, and we're so happy to be with you and to study the Bible with you. We've been studying the life of Paul. I believe this is lesson number 25 or 26 in a long series of studies on Paul's life. And so we continue the study. Let me bring us up to speed on where we quit off in our last study. And on the map here in front of me, you'll see the voyage that Paul has taken to Rome. They left, remember, Caesarea on the seacoast of Palestine. They traveled up and stopped first at Sidon, and then they went around the north side of the island of Cyprus over to a place called Myra, where they changed ships and found one coming out of Alexandria down in Egypt, and it was headed over to Rome. And so they caught that ship because the one that they were on was not going to Rome. And as soon as they left Myra, well, they got over towards Sindus. And with some difficulty, we noted, because there were some contrary winds that way. But when they left Sindus, headed down to Crete, they ran into even more problems with the wind. And so they sailed around the east side of Crete, where normally they would have gone across the top of Crete to the north. They went underneath it, and that gave them a bit of a windbreak. And there they did some things. They went to a place called Fair Havens. It was not a real good harbor to winter in because it faced the wrong direction and would have faced all of the bad weather they would have faced. And so there was a better harbor over here at Phoenix. Paul advised them, don't leave Fair Havens because there's going to be harm to the ship and to the cargo and to your lives if you do. And they didn't listen to Paul. They listened to the owner of the ship and the master of the ship, and thought that they could make Phoenix okay. It wasn't that far down the island. It was over on the west side, and they were about center way of the island. And of course, when they left Myra and rounded the Cape there was a strong nor'easter called a Euroclydon, a wind that often comes up in this region of the world, and struck the ship, and they were not able to stay on the course that they were on. I mean, they could not by any means sail to Phoenix. Even underneath the island of Crete, the wind was too bad. And so it blew them down 20 miles to the southwest to another island called Clauda, I should say. And there underneath Clauda, they got just a little bit of break from the wind for maybe 10 to 12 miles along that coastline on the southern side. And there they did what was called undergirding the ship. Frapping, it used to be called, where they passed capes or cables or ropes around the hull of the ship and anchored them on top of the deck. That kept the boards there that made up the bottom of the ship from separating and allowing it to leak and take in water. And so they held it more securely with the ropes or the cables. They did that. They turned the vessel in toward the wind while they did all of this and put the bow facing the wind. That allowed them a little break. On the back end, they had been towing a small boat, and they hoisted that boat on board. This took a lot of time. And this is the first day of that storm, and they worked a good part of that day preparing the ship now to get out on the open sea because there was no harbor here for them to stay in. So they took the mainsail down and the mast and laid them on deck where they wouldn't be a problem. They didn't need to catch any more wind. Then they turned that vessel broadside to the wind. They didn't want to sail. They didn't need any speed. They wanted to drift and just let the wind carry them sideways, we might say, and drift that ship westward if they could. They couldn't steer it. If they had turned the bow forward and let it blow on the stern, why, it would have probably taken that ship down here to quicksands called a Syrtis down here on the north coast of Africa. And they would have gotten stuck in those sands and the ship torn apart and battered by the sea. And they would have probably perished down in that area. So they did not want that to happen, and they turned broadside then to just let the ship drift. And it was 14 days later that they wound up on the island of Malta. Malta is south of Sicily, which is on the tip of Italy. And so here's the island here, Malta, where they had to spend the winter. They were shipwrecked there. So we talked about this voyage during our last study in great detail and talked about some of the things involved in it, what a fathom is and how much that should measure, and just some other things about sailing and such things that might help us understand the story a little bit better. Now let's remember that they indeed did not perish. They never lost a life. There were 276 of them on that vessel. They lost the ship. They had to throw the wheat overboard and lighten the ship on the way because of the storm. And so they all made it safely to this island, and that's where we left them. We left them here shipwrecked on the island of Malta. No vessel now, no cargo. Everything, their supplies, everything they had was lost. But they have their lives, thankfully, and they're all on this island. And now we're going to take up our reading here in Acts and go from there and let Luke, who was one of those on board. Luke wrote the book of Acts, and he's an eyewitness to everything that happened, of course. And usually he gives us great detail when he's traveling along with Paul. And we have a lot more information when Luke is present. So we're glad that he's there. And we take up the story now from when they've reached land on this island, what's called in Scripture in the King James, it's called Melita, but it's the modern day island of Malta, M-A-L-T-A. This is the winter of 60 A.D. when they're shipwrecked. So let's get that date down. This is the year, remember 60 A.D. is when Porcius Festus took Felix's place as governor. And that's how we know the exact date. And it was later that year, in early autumn, late summer, that they started out on this voyage. And now they've wound up on the island shipwrecked. It's been slow traveling, and here it is now, the winter of 60 A.D., and they'll run on into the spring on that island there of 61 A.D. All right, Acts 28 now, verse 1 and 2, we take up that reading. The Bible says here that when they were escaped, they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. We should note now that Melita was the ancient name for the modern day island of Malta. We should also note that there were two islands then called Melita. But the modern day island of Malta is the one upon which they landed. And the proof for that's abundant. I want to spend a little time and give you that proof, since there's two islands back then named Melita. We don't want to get them confused because both of them are fairly near Italy. And this one here has to be Malta because everything fits the idea that it is. Number one, the rate of drift of this ship is estimated to be about a mile and a half every hour, or that would be 36 hours every 20, or 36 miles every 14 days. The distance from Claudia, where they had undergirded the ship and started this letting it drift, from there to Malta was calculated on one occasion to be, really the distance was calculated at 504 miles. Now, if you took 14 days, multiplied it times 36 miles a day, you'd get 504 miles. And it was estimated that they had drift on this occasion, calculated to be 503. But the most of the calculations put the distance between Claudia, where they undergirded and started drifting, and Malta at about 480 miles between those two places. Between Claudia and Malta, 480 miles. There is a noted seaman by the name of Smith that estimated this ship to have drifted 476.6 miles in 13 days, 1 hour, and 21 minutes. Now, the reason that he calculated the time as 13 days, 1 hour, 21 minutes is most of the time during that first day of the 14 days, they spent undergirding the ship and hoisting that small boat on board and taking down the rigging, the mainsail and the mast, and preparing that ship to be a little bit better equipped to handle the storm that they were caught in. So they're estimating 13 full days of travel, and then say over an hour, maybe an hour, close to an hour and a half of sailing time that they would have had left on that very first day when they left Clauda and began to drift. So 476.6 miles out of the 480. The other island that they would have had to go to if they reached the other island called Melita would have been a whole lot further distance than this. And so this rate of drift that's estimated here fits exactly the island of Malta that they are said to have landed on. Number 3, Malta has a part of the island past one of the points on it, Point Koura, K-O-U-R-A, or Koura, however you pronounce it. And it juts out a little further to the north than any part of that island, because after you get past this point and this part that juts out, the island cuts sharply to the south, and they would have completely missed the whole island if they hadn't hit this one spot. When they took soundings, by the way, near this part of that island, and there's a bay there named St. Paul's Bay, where it's believed that's always been the traditional site where men believe that Paul's ship landed, where they were shipwrecked, where they hit the island, in other words. When you take soundings there, as we read about in Acts even, it's 20 fathoms deep when you begin to hear breakers along the shoreline.